when he was in jail. So he's the absolute pioneer of Australian cannabis, getting the word out there on all levels. Not only is he a doctor, a trained doctor, but he's done a lot of work with building with hemp and hemp seed. So he's the full encyclopedia of the weed, you know, the pot encyclopedia. Thanks heaps for being here.
Thanks, man.
I seem to know more about cannabis and getting the computer to vomit up its presentation, so it's going to have to be without graphics. Now, how many people in this room voted for the hemp party as number one in the Senate? Oh, good, so we're amongst supporters. I just want to spend a little bit of time on politics, because there's no point in talking about the medical aspects of cannabis without the politics. Right? I agree with some of the things that were said here about the police, but it depends at what level the police go. At the very highest levels, there's a level of malice and an anti-human sort of sentiment that really has to be addressed. I'll just give you a single example of that. We're all aware, and it always comes up, the issue of the saliva tests, right? Now, they shouldn't have been introduced in the first place. The evidence is they were introduced for financial gain by a bunch of Victorian senior police. They saw a financial opportunity to buy these crappy tests that haven't been properly tested, that have a 20% false positive rate, and then foist them on the community, even though there was no suggestion that they contributed to road safety. Right? Now, that was bad enough. But now, because people were successfully defending themselves in court and the magistrates were getting very sick of a long line of people being charged for nothing more than the trace presence of cannabinoids in saliva, further than that, people who evidently, the evidence is, if you ingest orally in a capsule a large amount of cannabis, you can be completely intoxicated and probably not fit to drive, but you'll be negative on the tests, right? Simply because that is not present in that water-based oral fluid, that systemic cannabis doesn't retrograde come to the saliva. It's only in the saliva in the first instance. And that might be why things like apple cider vinegar or Fisherman's Friends can work as masking agents. But what they've done in the last couple of weeks is changed the law now, so you don't go to a magistrate. If you're positive on the test, you lose your licence for 3 months automatically with no right to appear in court. Right? These aren't the actions of normal, decent people. I'll tell you, when I was having a debate maybe 12 years ago with a group of senior police about medical cannabis, I remember the words that one of them said. He says, "You're a smart ass, katelaris," with a snarl on his face. He said, "You might be clever enough to get some medical cannabis here, but we'll get you on the roads." Right? They're not the words of decent people. Right? And whilst the way I look at humanity, there's three groups of people. There's the people who have a human conscience and allow it to dictate their actions and their belief system. There are people, they're normal, properly developed human people. There are people without a human conscience, and they're properly described as sociopaths or psychopaths. And there's the majority of the people in this country that have a bit of an atrophied conscience, but they are too afraid to exercise it. And my job and all the activists' jobs is to waken up those people to become true activists. But I don't think we can rely on the good officers of the police. Right? From time to time, there are small discretionary advantages, but we haven't really changed anything. We've changed a legal prohibition now for a medical prohibition. We've got doctors, and I'm sick of people saying, "Oh, we've got to educate the doctors." Why should you educate someone who has been resisting the idea of medical cannabis for as long as I can remember? Right? Cannabis is a human right, and I reinforce 100% with what was said by Michael, that home growing is an indispensable human right. To make it worse, the way they've done it now, they've pharmaceuticalised cannabis, and all the commercial offerings of cannabis, and remember they're 3 or 4 times the black market price of cannabis, and the black market price is self-inflated, so they're charging $200 or even $300 for a gram of active. Now, whilst the science very clearly shows, and Malcolm was reinforcing that, the raw forms of cannabis are much more effective with fewer side effects and much better tolerated, whilst that occurs, none of the companies are offering CBDA or THCA. Right? We've been criticised for 10 years or more because we don't know what's in the cannabis that we dispense to the people. But if you look at these commercial offerings, none of them have got a proper printout of what's in it. They've just got the most crude percentages of THC and CBD. And as you must have learnt by now, the minor ingredients and the relative ratios appear quite critical. There is no mention of terpenes. So what they've done basically is set up a restrictive system, right, with an inferior product that is going to give a second-rate result, right? And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I don't want to spend all the time grumbling about the things that are now, because we always must look to the future and go forward from there. I'll just spend a few minutes on politics. We were delighted with the voter turnout for the Senate in the federal election. Now, if we're lucky enough in 3 years' time, or if we work hard enough in 3 years' time to actually get a senator elected, that's not going to change things overnight. But what it will do, it'll bring the voice of hemp into the mainstream. And that's why we want it. I mean, one senator can't change a law, but one vocal senator with the microphone can make a lot of noise. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is give you a reason why you should not only repeat your vote for hemp as number 1 in the Senate, but you should encourage your friends and family, even nag them and berate them and harass them to do the same. Because we only have one planet, and at this stage that planet is in very grave danger. If the planet was a patient, it'd be on the critical list, with no certainty that it's going to regain its health. That's the first thing. I think we can do it. I think we can have a green revolution, but it's not going to happen without a fair bit of commitment and courage, right? Remember that little saying, you've nothing to fear but fear itself. I mean, even getting a positive saliva test, it might be a pain, but compared to having an untreated disease, it's minor. Most people, say for instance I have a consultation with someone who's got a serious cancer, a life-threatening cancer, and they always turn the conversation to what will happen if I get a saliva test. And I said, lady or man, whatever it is, that's the least of your problems. I mean, you really have to keep things in perspective. That is the least of your problems. Now, it's sad now that there's no general appearance before a magistrate, and we're investigating the fine print of that legislation to see if it may be better to refuse to do the test, because that way you actually appear before a magistrate. Certainly if you're in receipt of medical cannabis in an official channel, that's what I'd do. I'd refuse to do the test on the basis that I'm taking a medicinal product, and then argue to the magistrate that it's oppressive that you lose your licence as a penalty for being sick and seeking a natural treatment. So that's something in progress. Just imagine what would happen if we let things go, right? Up to a few years ago, there was no saliva test. Then there was a saliva test with an appearance before a magistrate for drivers. Then there was a saliva test with no appearances before a magistrate. Before you know it, they'll do saliva tests for people at protests, right? It's bracket creep, right? We are on a slippery slope. Things will not get better automatically. Right? The people who run these sort of systems, the people that created the prohibition, know what they're doing. They're not stupid. It's not done out of ignorance. It's done for control of the population and for control of resources. Right? There has been a conscious effort to transit the world from a sustainable carbohydrate economy to a hydrocarbon economy. Now, a few times during the run-up to the election, I was asked by one or two of the radio stations, what's the hemp party policy on this or that or the other thing? I said, we don't actually have policies. What we have are concrete plans, and this is the plan. We just want a little bit of government assistance. The problem is, and this is a bit of good news, The day before yesterday, I visited the Dungog hemp mill down in the Hunter Valley. Now, I was consulted on its sort of setting up about 10 years ago when it just seemed like a pipe dream, and it was a total joy to walk into this mill, even though it's somewhat improvised in sort of the best Australian bush traditions and literally held together with wire and different things like that. But they've successfully provided the herd, the fibre, for 160 houses. Right? It's only a small start. There's thousands in Europe, but it's a great start, and it's something we can hang on to. One of my favourite photos that I had, the team from... We had hemp growing licences in the 1990s, and a team from the Hemp Embassy came down to help me harvest it. And one of the best photos I had was a big stook, the old-fashioned way of stooking up the hemp fibres, and one of the activists had a shirt on saying, "Overgrow the government." Right, and that's a really nice motto. I was going to show it to you, but the forces were against me on that one. There'll be another time. Okay, the plans of the hemp party. What we want, we're caught at the moment in someone who's trying to lift themselves up from their bootstraps, right? You need processing machinery, but without the fibre, you can't justify the investment in the processing machinery, right? And without the processing machinery, people don't grow the fibre. Now, luckily in the Hunter Valley, a little consortium there have taken the bull by the horns and tried to kickstart the movement. What we need to do is, our first plan is for the government to start a buyback of hemp fibre and storage at different stages. We've had massive stockpiles of wool. We want to do the same with the hemp fibre. Start at a reasonable market price buying the bast fibre from the farmers, so they're then encouraged to increase the area, and in just 2 or 3 years there would be enough fibre to justify the approximately $100 to $200 million to set up a hemp mill for textiles, or $300 or $400 million to set up a mill for paper. And what we would do in terms of, and this is where I think our major selling point is, there's always been a controversy, right, as to whether you can have an environment and employment, right? And the bloody argument is we've got to chop down the trees because we need the jobs, right? And the argument is, what? When the last tree is chopped down, what did that guy think? Oh, I need the jobs, I need the jobs, I need the jobs. Oh God, I need the trees even more than the jobs, right? With fibre, annual renewable fibre, we can resolve the controversy between employment and environment. Because of the agronomic benefits of hemp, and I'll just go through them very briefly. Remember, it has very modest water requirements because of the canopy closure of the plant. It conditions the soil because of its long taproot. It mobilises subsoil nutrients and brings them up to the surface. It's a beautiful crop to grow as a plantation, right? It self-mulches. Has anyone seen a hemp plantation here? Thing of beauty. It is a thing of beauty. What we do, by planting the plants quite close together, at about 4 to 6 weeks, we get what we call canopy closure, where the leaves of each plant interlock, and underneath is a shaded area. And as the plants grow up out of the ground, only the top metre has any leaves or seeds on it, and the bottom leaves drop off because of lack of light, and they form this beautiful mulch. So at the end, and smother the weeds. So at the end of the season, you've got this whistle-clean area that's beautifully mulched with all the subsoil nutrients being brought to the surface, and the bees are just unbelievable. I was at Morpeth growing a little hemp crop. There were so many bees in the flowers, you couldn't hear yourself talk, right? It was just absolutely amazing. It was like a dream coming true. But in practical terms, if we stockpile the bast fibre for just 3 years, it could be less if we adopted an urgency and the urgency that is required, but let's say for 3 years, then even private enterprise could establish a mill with confidence that there was enough fibre to put through the mill, and there'd be enough farmers then to generate the sort of volumes of ongoing, right? Now, housing. In my own lifetime, I've seen the affordability of housing going from being relatively easy. Most people, if they had a decent job and they were somewhat frugal, could afford a house, right? A 20-year-old today has zero Buckley's chance of owning a decent house anywhere short of Cobar or something like that, right, unless their parents are multimillionaires or they're involved with the government and some sort of graft, right? And that's a really sad thing. A house, a bit of security is an essential thing to a happy life in many ways, right? Then from that, if you have security of your property, you have security of a garden, you know, it goes on and on. But houses have become basically out of reach of almost everyone because of the speculative bubble. So a smaller number of people own a large number of houses and then rent them out at usurious prices, right? The building of houses has become outrageous. The average brick house generates 500 tonnes of carbon dioxide in its creation. Right, the calculations that have been done on an equivalent sized hemp house is that it has a net banking of about 50 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So every house we build out of hempcrete instead of bricks has a net saving to the planet of 550 tonnes of carbon. Right? Are you all familiar with sequestration? You know they're talking about carbon capture with the coal mines? Have you heard that dreamy term that they use? What they imagine, coal's not bad because we can capture the CO2 and put it underground where it won't sort of cause us any troubles. I mean, it's delusional, but the governments have offered hundreds of millions of dollars on research for that, right? 1 year's funding for carbon capture and storage, which will amount to nothing, could kickstart the hemp industry in a dramatic way. And like a lot of things, once they're started, they develop a life of their own, right? So, have you all seen the documentary $1 Billion Crop? Has anyone seen it? Oh dear. Get on YouTube and have a look at $1 Billion Crop. This was made in the 1990s and it was a documentary that was largely responsible for starting the hemp movement in this country. It had a very good response from the ABC and it was shown several times. One of the classic sections of that was a Henry Ford car built in 1941 out of hemp plastic. So as early as 1941, they had the very straightforward and simple technology to build a car out of plastic, so there's no rust, and it had 10 times the impact resistance of steel. So in the documentary, you'll see someone striking this car body with a sledgehammer with no damage being done at all, 10 times the impact resistance of steel, and that has been suppressed. Right? Suppressed technology and consumerism is strangling this planet. Right? They're keeping people happy with new models of cars that change the shape of their tail lights, but they don't essentially produce more safety or less expense. Are you aware here of the pneumatic cars that were built by Renault? In 1985, Renault built a car that was powered by compressed air. Right? It operated, the base was made out of a tank of carbon fibre. It was pumped up with a compressor and it ran for 200 kilometres on a charge of compressed air. Right? The engine had 3 moving parts. It's unbelievably simple. Right? There is no pollution at all. Only air that went in comes out at the other end. There was no radiator, there was no gearbox, there was no not even any oil used in the engine because they used a film of air as the lubrication for the piston. Right? This was made by a major car company and Catalyst did a great show on it, but they've taken it off the web. I should have captured that thing. They had a great show on it and suddenly it's not there anymore. The cars could be built for about $5,000 and run for about $3 per 200 kilometres, right? And if you used a solar accumulator, a 12-volt solar accumulator, so you could pump up the tank at night on compressed air, it'd run virtually for nothing, right? Humans are nothing if not intelligent, but the creative intelligence that we will depend on to get us out of the mire we're in is being suppressed by vested interest. And you see that never more clearly than in medical cannabis, right? The health bill in this country is rising at a near exponential rate, yet the delivery of services, the results, are getting worse and worse. How many in this room don't know someone, because it'll be a smaller number, who's suffering from cancer. Right? It's a epidemic of cancer. I made that comment to some medicos, and said, "Oh, I think you're exaggerating, Andrew." I think not. Right? When I was a student at Prince Alfred in 1970s, glioblastomas, the deadly brain cancer, was so uncommon that if one came into the hospital, everyone went to see the patient and look at the CAT scan and things like that. It was that uncommon. In my last job, before I was deregistered, I was working at North Shore Private Hospital. I'd see 5 a week. Right? It's unbelievable how the truth is just being hidden under a blanket of apathy and lies. Right? Now, what I want to talk about, though, even though cannabis clearly has remarkable healing properties, it's certainly not a panacea. And in people battling serious cancers, it's not a good idea to rely totally on medical cannabis as your only therapeutic modality. Right? I feel most of my sympathy for people with cancer by being bombarded with a whole lot of conflicting ideas about what's good and what's not good. And often during consultations we spend a lot of time talking about, is black salve good? Is this good? Is that good? Right? And these things, whatever they may be, it's hard to produce evidence to convince everyone of a position one way or the other. There are some non-cannabis modalities that are very effective in cancer, and this is what I want to talk about today. Basically, the ketogenic diet. Now, the ketogenic diet, when it's coupled with cannabis, is a very, very potent weapon against cancer. Also, if the ketogenic diet is applied prophylactically, you can dramatically decrease your chances of ever getting cancer. The allopathic view is that cancer strikes randomly through the genes by methods that we don't know, and there's very little you can do about it one way or another. That is clearly nonsense. Right? There is a massive nutritional component in cancer. There is a massive pollution effect in cancer, and that means pollution across the board. We heard from Malcolm about the microplastics. As alarming as he reported, it's much worse than that. In some of the beaches, you know the Central Pacific Gyre in the Pacific Ocean, have you heard of that? The Central Pacific Gyre? It's a continent-sized bunch of plastic between 1 and 3 metres deep, just below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, that's caught in a big gyre or a big swirling mass. So it basically vacuums up all this. I had a brief talk with the person, the marine biologist who discovered that, and he told me he had 10 years in the wilderness just getting it heard that this thing existed. And he also intimated to me, it's not the only one, Andrew, there's 4 others, right? So we have continent-sized masses of plastic going right through the food chain. There was a report even on our barrier reef. It's in the polyps, in the coral. It's almost everywhere. It's a really, really serious problem. In some beaches in Hawaii, some of the remote beaches, when they look at the sand itself, if you pick up a kilo of sand, 400 grams of that sand is microplastics. You got that? Right? I mean, I don't want to live in a plastic world. And to make it worse, it's not necessary. Does anyone here remember cellophane? What's cellophane? Cellophane is cellulose, plant cellulose that's been made into a polymer. Perfectly safe, it's got no phthalates in it. It doesn't break down with bisphenol A or anything like that. And suddenly you can't find cellophane. It's got to be some sort of polypropylene or polyethylene or polystyrene or anything like this. Australia at the moment is addicted to consumerism. We get goods from China by the internet and all the rest, and you open up your cardboard box of your little treasure and you've got each component wrapped in plastic, and then the little components are put in a plastic bag, then the whole bloody thing is wrapped up in styrofoam, which is almost impossible to get rid of. Right? Totally unnecessary. I don't want to be a stirrer, but sometimes if I need to buy something from a shop, I actually unpack it there. And I said, thanks for this item. I'll take the rest away. We've got to rationalise almost everything we do. And my policy is you can't fix anything without fixing everything. Right? Little bits and pieces can't be fixed. You have to actually fix everything. And that's really a change. So coming back to what the hemp party would do, social housing. I've built one small house, I suppose you call it a cabana, from hempcrete. It was one of the most pleasant weekends, and that's all it took for me to do. I'm no builder, and I've had no experience with it. Anyone who can operate with plasticine can operate with hempcrete. It's that easy. And people ask me, oh, can you do this or can you do that? I said, you can do anything your imagination indicates with hempcrete. You can do arches, you can do domes, you can do roofs. I mean, basically, the house we built had a foundation, a wall, a ceiling and a roof, all made of hempcrete. It was a completely hempcrete house, totally fireproof, totally termite-proof, and completely free of outgassing. Right? You get into a new car or a new house, what do you get exposed to? Serious carcinogenic outgassing of chemicals. Right? The hempcrete houses, there was an interesting anecdote from Great Britain. They were doing a comparative study on conventional housing and hempcrete housing, and they built 6 conventional houses in this block and 2 hempcrete houses at the end. And the builders were working on all the separate houses, but over time, all the builders just congregated in the hempcrete houses to eat their lunch. And when they were asked why, they said, oh, we don't know, we just like it here. I know what they're talking about. When I'm sitting in my little hempcrete cabana, I know exactly what they're talking about. But if you add the benefits of fireproof, and when I say fireproof, it's not fire resistant and it's not requiring bromides or other chemicals. You can't set it on fire with a blowtorch. Right? As an experiment, I made an oven from a 44-gallon drum and put about 15 centimetres of hempcrete insulation over it. You could sit your bare bum on that after 4 hours of hardwood fire in the tin. Unbelievable. You could survive a bushfire, just get in your hempcrete house, lock down the windows, right? It really is. Termites. I mean, how many chemicals and expense do we use controlling termites, right? What we'd want and what we would advocate for part of our plans, as well as establishing a paper mill, a textile mill, and social housing built around hempcrete. The beauty of hempcrete is you can do inside and outside. So, for instance, the kitchen benches would be made from the same material at the same time. So there's no cracks at the back for the rats and the mice and the cockroaches to get in. The whole thing is beautifully sealed, right? It really is a dream come true. And in the near future, we hope to be running little workshops on hempcrete, not for builders, but for people that just want to do garden furniture or restore their own rooms. Say, for instance, you've got a room with tacky plaster on it, you can take that plaster off and then hempcrete it. And if you want to go the whole way, then you take the outside wall off and hempcrete it, and you can actually rebirth your house as you go with dramatic improvement. Hey? It's nice. Oh, you agree. Yeah. So hempcrete housing, hemp paper, and hemp textiles. Now, where is all these microplastics coming from? How many people are wearing synthetics today? Yeah, guilty. I'm probably even guilty myself, I hope not. Right? The washing of the clothes is generating vast amounts of these microplastics. You lose so many grams of the stuff every time you wash the clothes. Right? We have to take individual and collective responsibility. Okay? But if, and I really do want you to become somewhat politically aware, we want not only people who vote number 1 for the hemp party, but we want people to proselytise for us, to talk it up. And over the next 3 years, we'll be producing basically campaign literature that shows why and how many of people in this country will benefit if we adopt these sort of things. Globally, we can not only meet our Paris Protocol Accords by going to hemp, we can double, triple or quadruple the amount of reductions in carbon dioxide. And then the only thing we have to do then to keep the levels down is stop the wars. And no one's talking about that at the moment. Right? Are you all aware that the Americans are trying to start World War III with Iran? Yeah, it's a shocking business. Right? Now, everyone said, oh, in 2003 I went and protested and no one listened to me and they invaded Iraq, and now it's happening again. It's easy to become apathetic, but that has to be resisted. right? I mean, life is surely worth fighting for. Huh? Your children are surely worth speaking up for. Of course they are, right? And that's what we must do. Okay, health now. The ketogenic diet has been used broadly across a number of different conditions for many years. In fact, before the rise of the modern anti-epileptic drugs, ketogenic diets were used to control epilepsy, and they were rather successful in doing it. The biggest problem with the ketogenic diets was what made up the diets. And unfortunately, whenever you bring up the tone of ketogenic diet, people's minds go to what the allopaths call a ketogenic diet, and that's a diet that's heavy in cream and bacon and meats and things like that. Are you all familiar with what ketogenesis is, or do you want just a minute on that? Okay, I'll just quickly go. Most of the fuel we use in our body is glucose. And the glucose is derived either from sugars itself or from complex carbohydrates from potatoes and breads and things like that, which are then broken down to glucose. And the glucose is the primary fuel of the body. But because the humans and most animals are designed for feast and famine, we store fat, visceral fat and body fat, and in times of restriction of food, that fat is mobilised, but not as glucose, it's mobilised as what they call ketone bodies. These are just little short breakdown products of the fat, and they work very efficiently as a fuel. Now, has everyone here heard of Otto Warburg? Otto Warburg was a German scientist in the 1930s who received a Nobel Prize for his groundbreaking research in cancer. And what Otto Warburg... Do you want to hear this? This is really important, right? I think it's really important. Otto Warburg proved, and he was a meticulous operator. I mean, I've done about 4 years of medical research in a laboratory at the benchtop and things like that. But when I read about what he did and his level of skill, you feel like a clumsy klutz. I mean, there are some people that are just sort of so much above us. He's one of them. Right? An amazing man. And he established, when he looked at cancer, and not at advanced cancer, but at very, very early cancer, the cancer that's transiting from normal cells onto cancer, he found that the change was not in the nucleus of the cell, not in the DNA, but in the mitochondria. Right? Now, the mitochondria are the little organelles within the cell that burn the glucose. They're basically little metabolic furnaces. And they burn glucose, in a sense, they burn it at room temperature, and they produce energy molecules called ATP. And the ATP is the currency the body uses to do all its processes. So if it's making something, it needs energy, it pulls in the ATP, and they're generated by the mitochondria. What Otto Warburg discovered across most common cancers was that the first thing you see was not a change in the nucleus, which you see later, but a change in the number of mitochondria. There was a reduction in the number of mitochondria from about 1,500 per cell down to about 700 per cell, and the ones that were there still were deformed. And it's the shape of them that makes them function. So if they're deformed, they don't function very well. So what he found was that a cell that was becoming cancerous, instead of being able to burn glucose with oxygen, called glycolysis, and produce 24 units of energy for each glucose molecule, they could only ferment the glucose. So they reverted back to a primitive form of existence where you could only ferment the glucose and derive 2 energy molecules, right? So the average cancer cell requires 12 times more sugar, more glucose, than a normal cell to achieve the same degree of metabolic activity. Has everyone here heard of the PET scan? PET scan is positron emission tomography. Basically what they do is radio-label glucose and inject it into the patient who's suspected of having cancer, and because the cancer overconsumes the sugar, because it needs 12 times or thereabouts times the amount of glucose just to function, they give radio-labelled glucose, leave the patient for an hour, and then scan them under a camera, and you can see where the radio-labelled glucose is accumulated. Now, a PET scan was only possible because of the research work of Otto Warburg, who demonstrated this overconsumption of sugar by cancer cells, right? because of the damage to the mitochondria, and the next I'll talk about why they're damaged. Right? So even though the allopathic doctors use PET scans, they try and ignore the fact of the metabolic rationale for why they're there. Right? Has anyone been to a cancer ward? What do you get? Cordial, donuts, biscuits. Right? It's a disaster, especially when it's very clear, even if you end up having chemotherapy, if you go into chemotherapy ketogenic, you not only have much fewer side effects and you tolerate a lot better, but the result is generally dramatically better. Right? Do they know that? They probably do at the back of their mind somewhere, or they would if they bothered to read the ancient, like the historical research literature, but they don't want to do that. So we're using Otto's work to make a PET scan, but we're ignoring the fact that it's really the major clue as what is going on with cancer. Right? This is really, really sad. Okay, so why are the mitochondria damaged? And this is really important because it's something you can do about it. And the earlier you do about it, the better it is. Because I've said, until I'm blue in the face, the only true cure for cancer is prevention. Right? I mean, once the cancer is there, it's harder. Right? It's much easier to prevent a disease, and it's much better to prevent a disease than have to deal with it or its consequences. Right? Now, as you probably know from biology in high school and things like that, the body's made of cells, and each cell has a cell membrane. Right? The mitochondria have cell membranes or subcellular membranes, and they're made of the fats and the lipids that we eat. Now, say for instance you build a house out of seconds bricks, crumbly old Besser blocks or something like that, what are you going to get? A crumbly old house. You have to, right? You can't make a silk purse from a sow's ear. We are only what we eat. And I know that's a cliche, but it especially applies to lipids and fats. Because if your membranes aren't made right, firstly, the mitochondria don't function properly, and if they're not functioning properly, they become susceptible to oxidative stress. It's a bit like, imagine the mitochondria like a furnace. You know, it's all happening at body temperature, but as a furnace throws out sparks from the processes of combustion, you need antioxidants to quench those sparks. You're all familiar with oxygen-free radicals. They're sort of metabolic byproducts of digestion and assimilation that can poison the body and damage every part of it and lead to a broad range of diseases. So in cancer specifically, a lifetime of wrong lipid eating ends up with defective membranes, which are then subject to oxidative stress, and the mitochondria fail. Your cell then reverts to fermentation, the internal pH of the cell changes, and that influences the nucleus. Right? And then we see what most doctors recognise as actual cancer. But what we see, what we call cancer, now that I know, is actually late stage cancer. The early cancer is happening at the very early stages of the damage to the mitochondria. So how do we reverse that? It's as simple as optimising your lipid intake. Right? I mean, how many people here have eaten a Krispy Kreme donut in the last year? Heaven, right? I mean, it's a path to destruction, right? You just imagine, it's not only Krispy Kreme donuts, biscuits, they're full of, the commercial biscuits, full of trans fats. And just as building a house out of crumbly bricks, you end up with a defective house, right? It happens. The doctors, if they were being, especially the oncologists, are operating in a pseudo-scientific atmosphere, because a few times they've disputed the Warburg, what we call the Warburg hypothesis of what causes cancer. And to solve the problem, they set up an experiment called the nuclear transfer experiment. So the question is cancer caused by a failure of the mitochondria, or is cancer caused by a failure of the nucleus? Right? And the easiest way to set that out, you have two cells, you pull the nucleus out of each one, and you reverse them. Okay? So if cancer is caused, as the doctors, the oncologists are saying, if it's caused by the nucleus, if you put a cancer nucleus into a normal cell, that should become cancerous. And if the Warburg school is right, if you put a normal nucleus into a cancer cytoplasm with dicky mitochondria, It should become cancerous. They did the experiment and they repeated it 100 times because they didn't like the result. The result was the cancerous cytoplasm induced cancer in a normal nucleus, not the other way around. The implications are massive because I think I can fairly safely say chemotherapy has arrived about as far as it can go. Right? They've been using chemo for decades now, and do people know how chemotherapy started? How the first patients got started on chemo? It's a very sad story. In 1943, the Americans illegally, by international law, brought a freighter of mustard gas to Italy. During the Second World War, when they invaded Italy, they brought a freighter of mustard gas into the place in the supposition that the Germans might also have gas, so they wanted some to throw back at them. But the Germans evidently got wind of this and bombed the ship in Binney Harbour and spread this mustard all over the place. Thousands of people died. And when they did the post-mortems on them, they saw that all their lymphoid tissue, their white cells, had been destroyed. So then someone said, oh, look, let's give it to leukemic patients. And they did. And for the first few weeks, there was a dramatic benefit. They killed off the white cells, but they always went too far, and then the people died of infection, or the tumour developed resistance and recurred. So chemo doesn't have a very glorious start. It wasn't begun by some sort of devoted scientist sitting there in a laboratory working hard. It was done in an illegal act of war. Right? And that really is a good epitaph for it. It's gone as far as they can take it. People, for instance, in glioblastomas, brain tumours, the survival rate hasn't changed since the 60s. Right? It might have changed a couple of months one way or another, but it hasn't really changed. The majority of people afflicted with that tumour are dead in 2 years. I'll talk a bit about the GW experiment where you can extend their life with cannabis, but we're talking about chemotherapy at the moment. And that really hasn't changed. So what they're coming up with now are what they call biological therapies. Things like Keytruda and Humira. These are either antibodies or other ways of interfering with the immune system, right, to try and use the immune system against the tumours. The most well-known one is Keytruda. The analogy is a bit like if the immune system is a guard dog, that guard dog is on a leash, right? They're called checkpoint inhibitors. But these antibodies block the checkpoint inhibitor, the thing that regulates the immune system and basically unregulates it. And certainly in 20% of the patients that they treat, especially with melanoma, you can get a very dramatic benefit. And you must have read about that in the newspapers. Things like the treatment costs $90,000 a year. But your dramatic benefit in 20% of the people. What they don't say in the news reports is that 20% suffer catastrophic autoimmune diseases and die. Right? So we have an unholy alliance between the research scientists in pharmaceutical companies, the doctors who are there basically drug pushers, and the media who are basically their cheerleaders. So they report all the good news and none of the bad news. Right? The biologics operate on the assumption that drivers in the nucleus influence the cancer. And of course, it's a bit like they say breast cancer is driven by estrogen. So they give people tamoxifen to block the estrogen. But the results are fairly disappointing. And they're often exaggerated by the medical literature by not reporting their failures and only reporting their successes. So say, for instance, me and Malcolm sort of tallied up the patients we've treated and we excluded all the ones that died or dropped out for side effects or had other problems and only reported the ones that did really well. We would look like $1 million. The only problem is it's not true, right? And it's morally dishonest to conduct themselves like that. That's what they're doing at the moment. Also, when you look at the literature in some of the biological treatments, they'll say and report 50% improvement in survival in such and such a disease. But when you look at the data, instead of dying in 4 months, you die in 6 months. And the last 2 months are spent in hospital on a drip because you've got opportunistic infections. You know, there's a lot of dishonesty in the way things are reported. Okay, how do we get out of this? I strongly encourage most of the patients I deal with cancer to at least look very carefully at a nutritive ketogenic diet. Now, the first thing we have to do, because of all the errors of the past, is undo people's conception of what a ketogenic diet is. They might say something like, oh, I've tried that and I got really sick on it, which you would. How can you make a breakfast out of bacon and cream? You know, it's so at odds with good nutrition as we understand it, plant-based nutrition, right? But now that we've finally got hemp seed legalised, a proper nutritive ketogenic diet, which is strongly anti-inflammatory, is achievable for everyone, right? The hemp seed, I mean, I hope you've read all the literature on the hemp seed, but it is one of the few foods around that deserves to be called a superfood. Right? I mean, it's all very well to call a goji berry a superfood, but basically it's just got a little bit of, I mean, don't downplay it, but it's basically an antioxidant. Hemp seed is a balanced nutritional powerhouse. Right? Now, I don't exaggerate that at all. It has more protein than steak, it has more omega-3 than fish, it has more B group vitamins than yeast, and more minerals than most other foods. But more than that, it has them in a balanced package. The trouble with our pharmaceuticalised world, they think that you can just throw things at the body. You know, you can take 100 times more of this and less of that. And there was one little thing that I suppose I queried that Malcolm said, that this particular cannabinoid can cure all diseases, right? To be free of disease, you certainly need an endocannabinoid system that works perfectly. But taking exogenous cannabinoids, that's cannabinoids from the outside, whether smoking or eating or whatever you do, that's not producing them at the right time. It's certainly very useful in an emergency situation, but if the nutrition is correct and you've spent the last several years eating the right lipids, right, in the right balance, your body's endocannabinoid system produces the cannabinoids that are needed in the right amount, in the right part of the body, right? I mean, what we do, whilst it's helpful, and I mean, I've seen enough cured or well patients to know that it's massively helpful, it's a fairly clumsy instrument, right? I mean, the long-term goal of any real health practitioner is to restore internal, vibrant, good health, right? It is very possible to wind back the clock, right? I mean, even 10 years of abuse can be counted in about 3 years of careful nutrition, right? In the near future, we'll be producing some literature on our version of the ketogenic diet. There's a few other important things you have to bear in mind. Simply restricting the hours that you eat food, right? And remember, they say, oh, you've got to start with breakfast and you have this and you spread your eating over the time. That's not necessarily the best thing. We require of the patients a restriction in the hours that they eat food, and we want to set a message that's achievable, because there's no point in making something that's too hard for people. But simply by restricting your hours of eating to 6 hours, and that can be, say, from 9 till 3 in the afternoon, or from 12 to 6, or whatever suits your particular lifetime, by restricting the hours, that's giving your body 18 hours to go the other way. There's all sorts of major benefits. Control of blood pressure, general feeling better. It's amazing that simple modification of what we're told to do makes a dramatic difference, right? And if you couple that 6 hours restricted hours of eating with nutritive ketogenic foods, and it's very easy to work out what's low glycemic, right? The internet has lists of foods that have low levels of carbohydrate, and it's as simple as getting a list of low carbohydrate foods, which include all the fresh greens, the pumpkins, the carrots. All these things are less than 10% of carbohydrate, whereas you exclude the wheat and the potatoes and things like that. We're talking about cancer treatment. Healthy people don't need to do that, right? A healthy person who's active physically can easily assimilate and digest those sort of foods, but we're targeting these comments to people who already have cancer. And worse than that, people who have cancer that's been multiply treated by chemotherapeutic agents and's already mutated, right? And the same thing happens with cannabis. I've seen it more than once. It was very disappointing, where you get a dramatic response to a Rick Simpson style preparation, but a year later or 2 years later, the patient relapses and dies. Right? And the usual explanation by the enthusiasts, oh, they didn't take enough or they stopped taking it or something like that. But when you're using cannabis in massive doses, like the Rick Simpson style treatment, that's actually using cannabis as a drug. And there's nothing wrong with using it as a drug, but for good health, I find it's better to use it as in a much more moderate sort of dose. And the only times now I really use Rick Simpson, massive, like gram a day for 60 days type of thing, is when there's an urgent, immediate threat to someone's life, like a growing brain cancer or widespread metastases or something like that. But for someone who, for instance, has had a breast lump discovered, goes to surgery, we strongly encourage them not to have the radiation and not to have the chemotherapy at that time. The doctors frighten the patient, saying that if you don't have the chemo and radiation now, you'll get sick and die, right? Nothing's further from the truth. What happens there, and this is a bit of false advertising, right? The doctors will tell you, okay, the lumps out of the breast, you must have radiation. And it's true that if you have radiation to the affected site, the chances of a local recurrence is reduced. There's no doubt about that. It's not massively reduced, but you have a much lower probability of having a local recurrence, and they hang their hat on that as a reason for giving you radiation. What they don't say is it doesn't reduce your chances of metastatic spread, and when that thing metastasises, it comes out in a resistant form. Right? Cancer's not a static disease. It moves with the times, and it almost invariably moves downhill to least and least differentiation. So it becomes just microscopically angrier and angrier until it's simply uncontrollable. So the time to get cancer, if not at the preventative mode, it's at the early stages. And there's a little saying, I think Mark Twain said it, it's a lot easier to fool people than to convince people they've been fooled. And I've found that over and over. I mean, whether you're talking about the World Trade Center or weapons of mass destruction or whatever, it's a lot easier to fool people than convince them they've been fooled, because no one likes to think they've been led up a garden path, right? It's what we call sometimes cognitive dissonance. I mean, if you tell the majority of people in this country we are actually governed by a group of people that are completely happy that you or your family sicken and die, so their mates in the pharmaceutical corporations can take money. Oh, they wouldn't do that to us. They are, right? That's where it's up to. All right? I've probably spoken for it. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah. These people that you're talking about are absolutely failing. Basically, everybody's saying hooray for their side, yeah? This is one fight with the marijuana, and good luck to you, very good luck to you getting a hemp party in. I just can't see it happening whatsoever. But has anybody heard of Extinction Rebellion?
Get a microphone, mate.
Oh, God, no.
Yeah. Stage fright, come on, mate, you stood up now. Hey.
I'm not standing up there.
There you go.
I hate... Oh. Hello? Yeah. I hate this. This is fucking my biggest fear, honestly.
Room 101, mate.
Yeah, I'm on a big journey to deal with my demons there. Anyway, has anybody heard of Extinction Rebellion? It's the latest set of people that are trying to save the planet. It's the latest set of people that are trying to save the planet. Okay, everybody's saying hooray for their side. Hooray for their side. And good luck getting a hemp party in. I'm a practical person. I don't believe that will happen at all. Good luck. I hope it does.
It's actually happening.
Good. But the way dealing with those people that you're talking about, fucking good luck. But the Extinction Rebellion are trying to eventually take over the powers that be and get somebody decent in there. Has anybody heard of them? You have. Has anybody been to the rallies and protests? Fantastic. Have you?
No. You're saying extinction?
Extinction Rebellion.
What's the question?
Is we need to just all come together and fight under one umbrella. You're going for one problem. We've got 1,000, but we need people like you at Extinction Rebellion to help spread the word and speak, because there's people like me who can't speak publicly.
Yeah, you're doing okay.
No.
All right. No, the question there is, as I understand it, there's so many different issues in the world, you know, how can one issue fix them all? That's probably why I chose hemp as my lifetime activity, because it incorporates medicine, it incorporates environment, employment. It's almost everything. What our overarching business is to convert the hydrocarbon economy that is strangling the planet back to a carbohydrate economy, right? And to say it's not happening, I mean, that's really flying in the face of the facts. We've got 160 houses up. 2 years ago there was 0, right? We didn't have hemp seed legalised. We're getting it now, right? Talking about medical cannabis, all these things, it is starting to happen. It's likely, unfortunately, that Australia is going to be a runner-up rather than a trendsetter, and that really pains me. Like, we started this version of the hemp revolution in 1988, but then I discovered newspapers from here in the 1970s which were saying the same things that I thought I'd sort of made up, right? There's nothing new. I mean, people have been working on this, but finally the camel's got its nose under the tent, right? And it's virtually unstoppable, right? In China now, I'm told that they're running whole army groups on hemp products as a strategic reserve, right? We've already heard they're using it for plastics. We're a holdout, and things sound a lot worse than what they are, because Australia has one of the most tightly constrained medias in the world. You might think that's an exaggeration. Hey?
He's really right in a lot of ways, Andrew. Look, you know, fighting through the system that is totally buggered, totally corrupt. You're right to do it.
Yeah.
You've got my support to do it, but it's not the way we're going to win.
Listen, I think the system is going to fall under its own weight,
yes,
right? But what we have to do, though, but what we have to do is be ready to pick up the pieces, right? So let's say the electricity grid goes down in a solar storm. Let's say we have a major flu pandemic. You know, let's say we have a global conflagration. All these things, how are we going to pick up and how are we going to regreen the planet?
Yeah.
So the way it works,
That's a single entity, because that's what we are, the people. This is what I think this is what his point. I think this is what his point is. No, it's all right. You mate. I think that's what his point is that we are one group actually, and this is a specialist prong on the spear, if you like. But we are the one spear. We are looking towards the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just one of them. I would love for you to research Roger Hallam and Extinction Rebellion. Find out what they did in London. It's amazing. Please look into it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, and good luck.
Well, anyone who resists has my support, right? Remember, the only fight you're not going to win is the one you don't fight, all those sorts of things, right? But what I'm hoping for, I mean, I don't like global chaos. I would really like to see a soft landing. You know, I'd like to see a gradual, or not too gradual, transition from the hydrocarbons to the carbohydrates. Right? Whether it takes a blow up in the Middle East and a reduction in petrochemicals to do that, I don't really care. I don't care if there's a solar storm that wipes out the grid. Right? I mean, there'll be ructions, but we have to have something to put in place, and that's what we're doing here. Right? We're not just going to march into power and say, yeah, it's our turn now, but we'll either do it gradually or as a result of a catastrophe. And I certainly hope it's a gradual transition, but we have to be prepared for whatever comes.
Absolutely. Will you please look into Extinction Rebellion?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
It's. I hope that's a rebellion against extinction. Is that...
I don't like the name, it's a little bit scary, but just look into it.
Mate, when you say a little bit scary, if you go and look at the what's happening, it's a lot scary.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, is there any other questions? Oh, right. Now remember, each person's different, and part of the consultation, if it's conducted properly, is to actually explore the personal values and the personal strengths that the patient has to see, because you can't expect a person to be able to do more than what they can do. And most of the people that come to me are in the better sort of class of humanity. They want their health back and they're prepared to go out of their way to get it, right? If there's no secondary spread, right, an immediate highly nutritive ketogenic diet and moderate amounts of cannabis, right? A few other bits and pieces you can do, all aimed at the prevention of and the reversal of the condition that led to it. See, my argument is this. If they talk about mopping up cancer, it's a fallacy. Like, breast cancer is generally considered to be micrometastatic. By that I mean it often travels before it's detected. Right? Other cancers tend not to do that. Melanomas tend not to. Bowel cancer almost never does. But breast can be like that. So radiating here, like I said in the talk, it only reduces local recurrence, but not the risk of systemic recurrence with resistant cells.
So are you saying no radiation whatsoever at all?
Oh, no. I mean,
Once you get yourself to a point where your body's basically as fit as it can be post-surgery?
No, I've even recommended, I think this person, for instance, maybe chemo's a go for you or radiation is necessary for control. For instance, if someone has a major metastatic deposit in their hip and the hip is about to shatter, right, I mean, you can eat a lot of cannabis, but you'd be very lucky to get a response, especially if it's your third or fourth treatment cycle, right? But then the contract you have with the patient, yeah, I'm suggesting this now, your chance of a cure are not high, but we should be able to get local control. So it's got to be horses for courses, and there's no point in being a Pollyanna and thinking what you do can fix everyone, right? But we've had some good overall results for life extension with radiation, but I mean, it's a hideous modality, and I insist wherever possible that cannabis treatment is used at the same time to try and minimise the side effects of that. Certainly works with chemotherapy. I mean, the shocking side effects of chemotherapy, the neuropathic pain and things like that, can almost completely obliterate that and certainly improve the outcome. So, yeah, I only use...
There's a lot of research that already supports all that kind of that outcome, for sure. It's just interesting listening to you kind of advocating for not going down that radiology...
Not doing the radiation prophylactically. I only use radiation as a desperation measure when the disease is out of control, right? And I mean, luckily with radiation, often the side effects are 10 years in coming. Like, radiation-induced cancers are usually 10 years in the making, so it's not an immediate threat. It's not like the chemo, which gives you low white cells and the risk of infection next week, right? So there is a place. It's not a place that I like to be in, and if I'm recommending that I think radiation may help someone, it's usually an admission of failure and a transition from a complete transition to wellness to a holding pattern to a life extension, right? But you can't turn your back on some of the science. I mean, yeah, we try and sort of produce what's best for the person at that particular time, right? It's the prophylactic use of radiation to reduce the risk of recurrence, which I really rebel at. Is that clear?
Yeah, I understand, and I think we have a better insight into what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Another question that comes back to you. With depression, in those situations where you're dealing with people that are going through breast cancer and bone cancer, like that, there is a high incidence of depression, anxiety, PTSD. What are your thoughts on treatments for those as well?
They're essential, right? It's without getting the mind right.
How do you go about treating that?
Well, it's not one size fits all, right? The most productive way, ultimately, is to harness the power that's within the person, right? And like I said, the first assessment you make of someone with a serious cancer diagnosis is what their attitude to it is. Are they already defeated? Right? There is an increasing place for psychedelic drugs. Things like psilocybin and ketamine, perhaps LSD, but certainly psilocybin, is a very, very useful modality for this reason. There's a condition called timor mortis. Everyone's heard of rigor mortis. Rigor mortis is when you die, you go stiff. Timor mortis is a fear of death. And I tell people, because you can feel their fear coming out of the pores of their skin, I say, look, that fear is going to drag you into the grave a lot earlier than you need to be there, right? So we're broadening to investigate the use of, say, psilocybin under reasonable conditions for people who haven't experienced it before, to remove the fear of death, right? And sometimes it may be that you don't extend a person's life, but it gives a life more meaning, right? Spending your last year of life sort of quivering about your death is a really sad thing, right? So the depression and the anxiety must be addressed, because if you don't address them, you'll never win, right? There has to be a certain sense of self-belief. Right, the Gawler Foundation, way back as early as the 60s, they did a lot of experiments with visualisation with cancer treatments. And it's not the same as meditation. It's a very simple mental process where you visualise a light filling your body and disease being carried away, and you do simple exercises however many times a day you need it. They had a similar result, beneficial result, as with chemo, but without the chemo, right? Those sort of things sound airy-fairy and a little bit hippie, but they're critical, right? If you don't start with the mind, you can't treat a complex entity like a human being as a piece of meat, right? You just don't get the results you want. So that I consider my starting point on almost all cancer treatments. Huh? Yeah. Anyone else?
Just a medical question. If Warburg says disease can't...
Just speak up, please.
Warburg says disease can't live in an alkaline state in the whole.
Warburg did not say that, right? What Warburg said, there are many causes of cancer, but the one commonality is the inability to respire with oxygen, even though oxygen's present, right? I'm glad you asked that question, because this is one of the most painful bugbears that rational people have in treating cancer. They talk about an alkaline environment, and then you even go as far as say you can cure cancer shoveling sodium bicarbonate into your cake hole. I mean, it's a complete nonsense. But where the misapprehension came from, remember what I said, that as the mitochondria are destroyed, the cell can no longer metabolize glucose properly. It can only ferment the glucose. And a byproduct of the fermentation of the glucose is lactic acid. So the internal environment in the cell becomes highly acidic, and that's what dysregulates the nucleus, right? I mean, I studied naturopathy before I studied medicine, and I sort of went to medicine because I thought the naturopaths were a bit sort of woolly-headed, things like that. And one of the things, I sat in this talk and this guy's talking about, oh, you've got to alkalise the body. And I said, well, that's interesting. I said, what about lemons, mate? I mean, they're acidic. But, you know, even my grandmother knows they're really good for your health. And he sort of said, oh, yeah, they're acidic, Andrew, but they leave an alkaline residue. I said, you're full of shit. And I sort of left you know. It's, what's that?
If you actually read some of this, it says that the lemons are acidic and turn the body alkaline.
Yeah, I know, that's what he said too, but it's not the way it works, right? Because that's not the model that we do, right? An internal pH in the cell can't be corrected by eating bicarbonate. I mean, it's so obvious. If you take a teaspoon of bicarbonate, what happens to it? It reaches your stomach acid. And remember, your stomach's got acid similar to battery acid. It's just neutralised in a flash, right? Some idiot I saw, oh, look, give them a teaspoon of sugar and a teaspoon of bicarb, and the sugar, because they want the cancer wants the sugar, will carry the bicarb to the cell and kill it. You know, it's sort of painful, right? But this whole idea of alkalising, it was always the right practice. See, and a so-called alkaline diet is a very high antioxidant diet. It's got nothing to do with the pH, right? I mean, I spent about 20 years working in hospital departments and things, and I did thousands and thousands of arterial pH measurements, where you stick a very fine needle in someone's radial artery and measure the pH. And unless you've got diabetic ketoacidosis, you can be sick as a dog with cancer. Your pH stays at 7.4 until right at the end. And once it gets to just 7.2, you're heading for death, right? That's how tightly it must be controlled. Now, as a final argument for that, has anyone ever seen someone having a hyperventilation attack? Yeah. What happens? If you hyperventilate, you blow out carbon dioxide, which is carbonic acid. And as you blow out carbon dioxide, the pH of your body moves from 7.4 to 7.5. And what happens to the patient? They get carpopedal spasm, their eyes roll up into their head, and they just can't function. right? If that's the product of alkalosis, I don't think anyone actually wants it. It's a confusion between the external environment and the internal cellular environment, right? Cancer is associated with acidity, but it's a lactic acidosis intracellularly. Does that clear that up? Yeah, and the alkaline diet works because it's whole natural foods with high ORAC, or oxygen radical absorbance capacity. Is that clear to everyone? That's an important point. Huh? No, when you say acidic, so you've got to be careful, right? The pH is a measure of how many hydrogen ions. They're acids, but they're damn weak acids, right? You know, the pH scale 7 is neutral, and as you go into smaller numbers, it becomes acidic. But the difference between 7 and 6 is not 1, it's 10. And the difference between 7 and 5 is not 2, it's 100. It's a log scale, right? So these acids are weak organic acids. I mean, they're like 6.9 or 6.8, you know, it doesn't rate. And also the amount you take in has no impact, zero impact. Let's say, for instance, someone injected, or you ate a lot of, say, strong acid, right? No, say strong alkaline. Your body regulates it through the kidneys and through the breathing to keep the pH exactly right. Yeah, so don't fuss about acidic cannabinoids because you're taking them in milligram doses, right? Yeah, they have no systemic pH change. And your body has an amazing capacity to buffer acids, right? Because like I said, once you're down to 7.2 or 7.1, you know, the angel of deliverance is not far away unless someone works very quickly on you. It must be neutral, yeah. But if you get that argument, the easiest way to explain to people is with the hyperventilation. That you can alkalise the body, but you'll end up with muscle cramps lying on the floor, right? Not what anyone wants. See, that's why you treat it with rebreathing into a paper bag, right? The CO2 just goes back instead of being blown away, and it all comes back to normal once the pH is restored. Yeah. But geez, why do mistakes just get embedded in people's minds? You know, I hate having to go over the same, I mean, not now, but, you know, with patients, you've got to worry about the same worries all the time rather than going forward in what's positive, right? Your body is an electrical machine, and the better the food you eat, the more vital the food you eat, the higher the voltages in each cell. Like each cell's about 150 millivolts, but you can charge them up just like a flat battery or a charged up battery. Right? It's worth the effort of looking after your health, right? And it's sad for me that most people take better care of their car, right? They'll take more care about what oil you put into your car than what oil you put into your body, right? And they have the same catastrophic effects if you get the wrong ones. Is that a fair comment? Okay. Anyone else? Enough? Yeah, we're putting something down on paper in the near future, and we'll send it up to the hemp embassy to be distributed, because.
Meanwhile, is there any way we can look to get? Because I've heard a bit about it, got confused.
Yeah, no, I mean, blame slackness. There's several versions, but as you learn more, I mean, for instance, it completely changed once we got access to hemp seed. It just became so much easier. Right? The other really sad thing with cancer, and most people don't like to hear this either, there's the old saying, a lot of people dig their grave with their knife and fork. And that's very true. Simply restricting the calorie intake of rats, right? Just restricting the calorie intake by 20% dramatically increases their lifespan, right? Because whilst you're in that ketogenic phase, the body does its housekeeping. If you can manage to fast for 2 days, you can renew about half your immune cells, right? It has a dramatic effect. So what you eat and what you don't eat are of equal importance. Hey? Yeah. But for now, I'll just give you a few little fringe. Before you even go ketogenic, anyone who's got children, I mean, there's a lot of controversy over dairy foods. And people say, is milk good? And I hate simple dualities. You know, I say, if you've got a contented cow living on green pastures and you go and milk that and you don't have a lactose allergy, yeah, you've probably got a nutrient food, right? But what do we get now? They've industrialised milk production, right? The reason, you know why they used to pasteurise milk? Because all the cows had tuberculosis, and if people drank the milk, they got tuberculosis in the gut, right? But the TB, all the herds are TB tested now. There's no TB. The reason why they're pasteurising them now, in my opinion, there's two reasons. The first one is it gives a big company control of the milk supply. If you're not allowed to sell raw milk, you've got to ship all your milk to the factory. I was living up at Dungog some years ago, right? They had all the dairies there. They wouldn't sell you any milk. They'd let you go and fill up a jug while they didn't look, but they wouldn't sell it to you because it was against the law. They also told me that because of the mechanical milking, there's a lot of pus in the milk. And there's some little dip test that the carrier does, and if there's too much pus, he rejects it. But the reason why they're pasteurising it now, as well as get control of the industry, is to kill the pus from the bloody mechanical milking at the home. It's pretty disgusting. But also, too, the process of pasteurisation destroys the value of the milk in the same way that overcooking some food does, right? In a natural way, the milk has a lot of enzymes in it. I'm not a fan of animal milk. I prefer nut milk much better, and hemp seed milk much better still. So say you've got children and you want to send them off even with Wheat Bix or something like that, you can dramatically improve their breakfast nutrition. Little blender, you put some hemp seed, right? Say it's a big kid, maybe 2 or 3 tablespoons of hemp seed, a little bit of chia seed, and I'll just finish on this because it's an important distinction, an important thing I haven't mentioned. Hemp seed has a 3-to-1 ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, and that's considered the ideal for long-term administration. Right? Omega-6 produces inflammatory cytokines in the body, and they're necessary, but omega-3 produces calming cytokines in the body, and our body stays in balance by the right mixture of the two of them, right? Unfortunately, most people in this room and most people in this country are nowhere near a 1-to-3 ratio. In some of the people that have been measured on the standard American diet, what we call the SAD diet, right? They're up to 1-to-10. They have so much omega-6 because all the fresh food has the omega-3 and the omega-6 is in all the processed foods. So there's a massive overabundance of omega-6 and a minuscule amount of omega-3. Chia seed is one of the very few foods in the world that has much more omega-3 than 6. It has a 2-to-1 ratio. So what we're encouraging people to do is use, say, 3 tablespoons of hemp seed and 1 tablespoon of chia seed in a smoothie to rapidly correct the omega-3 deficiency. The hemp seed provides all the cofactors that are necessary, and the chia provides the extra omega-3. So you have a child, you throw in some berries or something like that and whip it up, you can use that as the milk for their breakfast cereal. Right? And you do that for long enough and you'll find the child's mind can develop better. Also you'll find, and it's my limited experience, but it was pretty clear, they become much more tractable in their behaviour. Right? A lot of that's why we sort of try and encourage it in autism and things like that. When there's enough omega-3 on board, especially coupled with a high antioxidant diet, you generally see it in terms, the kid just becomes more bearable, you know, like better to be with, more fun. Right? So, yeah, it's worth doing it. The rewards are great.
Sorry, I've only just come in recently. I've got a genetic cancer and I've been following the Budwig protocol with the flaxseed oil and cottage cheese.
Yeah.
The hemp seed oil and chia seed.
Okay, now that's a really good question. The Budwig protocol, for people who don't know it, Johanna Budwig was a German medical scientist who cured a lot of people using a combination of flaxseed oil and quark, which is a form of cottage cheese, from what I gather. I don't think there's anything magical about the Budwig protocol per se, and what was available in Germany 100 years ago or 50 years ago is very different now. I mean, they were using whole raw milk and stuff like that. It is critically important for cancer management to increase the omega-3, amongst other things. I feel at this stage that the Budwig version, or our version of the Budwig protocol, and that really just means the augmentation of the omega-3, is best done with hemp seed supplemented with chia seed. right? What I do too, and there's especially when someone's critically ill, right, and you have to do things rapidly, you not only have a berry smoothie, for instance, for breakfast, but say you make a salad, what we'd encourage people to do is put 1 or 2 tablespoons of hemp seed, some lemon juice and a clove or 2 of garlic. The idea of using quark in the Budwig protocol was to provide sulfur amino acids, and the sulfur amino acids help in the utilisation of the omega-3, right? But if you whip up lemon juice, hemp seed and garlic, you get the same Budwig effect, only better, in my opinion, right? Because you're not sort of troubled by the dairy issues and the saturated fats which compete with the omega-3. So yeah, I think it's vastly superior to do it in a non-animal form. Yeah. No?
Just a quick one, Andrew. Is the outer shell of the hemp seed, is that nutritional or
Okay, that question arises when people flogging hemp protein and things like that. I think not. From what I've seen from the few analyses, is that there's a little bit of calcium, but not much. And the degradation, I mean, I think the ideal food is just a whole hemp seed, right? I really don't like people pressing hemp seed as oil. And I'll just speak to that for a moment because I think it's important. It's like, say you've got a near perfect food, by the time you've pressed it into oil, you've removed the omega-3 rich oil from its protective protein matrix and all the vitamin E there that's protecting it from rancidity and oxidation, and you put it in a bottle which then starts to oxidise no matter how carefully you look after it. Worse than that, all the cofactors, the B group vitamins and the minerals that are required are left in the seed cake. Worse than that is people are paying big money for hemp protein, but 50% of it is shell with minimal amounts of nutrition. So you're paying high dollars for very little. So the best way to use hemp seed nutrition is the whole hemp seed, in my opinion. We used the shell when we were hulling as a mulch in the garden. Excellent. But yeah, I don't think it's got a lot going for it. Listen, when we first had hemp seed, I mean the first industrial hemp seed, I knew I had to eat these seed. I was suffering at that time with a lot of arthritis and things, and I just knew I had to eat it. We just ate them whole. And in Nepal and places like that, they fry them lightly with a bit of salt, and that's their sort of picnic food and stuff like that, right? That's an acceptable way to do it. But for Australians who need to eat relatively larger amounts to get the omega-3, because we're always behind, I think the whole hemp seed can't be beaten. Hey? No, the whole seed, because it's hard work. I mean, we're not chooks and things like that. I mean, you don't eat peanuts with the shell on them, and it's the sort of same with the hemp seed. Hey? I mean, I don't mind eating whole hemp seeds if they're big and plump, but in terms of especially children, I mean, they'll start belly aching. I mean, when we first marketed the hemp seed, our separation wasn't very good, and everyone's complaining of getting the seed stuck in their teeth. All right. Yeah, no, but bottom line is minimal nutrition. You can say it's got fibre, but, you know, you'd better do to have vegetable fibre. Yeah. Huh? Enough? Oh.
Is the whole hemp seed available at all the stores?
Whole, H-U-L-L-E-D. You can't sell whole hemp seed. When we're applying... Oh yeah, it became legal last year.
Can I just ask, with what you're saying, I know with linseed, you must break it and mill it.
Oh yeah, but linseed's very different than hemp seed, right? Yeah. No, that's obviated by the fact that you only buy the hemp seed already hulled. See, the government wasn't prepared. We had negotiations with them. They weren't prepared to legalise whole hemp seed in case all you nasty law-breaking sort of retrobates wanted to go out and plant it, right? And then, so we were stuck in a situation. The only way we could have whole seed was to have it steam sterilised. And on balance, it's a lot better to have it not heat-treated and hulled, right?
So all the nutrition's still there in the whole seed?
Totally.
And
Yeah.
hemp seed oil, a tablespoon a day, which has just taken the edge of my pain away. really helped me that much.
Hemp seed oil, nutritional oil.
Hemp seed oil I bought from the chemist, but I believe it's very good for you in other areas.
Well, no, I just spoke to that. The problem with it's better than nothing. But see, the trouble is when you've got an oil like flaxseed oil or hemp seed oil, right? Unless it's very, very carefully extracted, and there's a lot of dishonesty in the food industry, right? Everyone, cold pressed oil, what they call cold pressed oil, just means there's a legal definition. It means there's no heat added from the outside. But the unscrupulous operators just rank up their expellers, and the temperature of the expeller head can be 300 degrees. So they get maximum extraction, but it's not it's legally cold pressed, but it's not technically cold pressed, right? The problem with separating the oil from the seed, as what I just said a bit earlier, is you expose the oil to rancidity, and more important than that, you remove it from its cofactors. That means the other nutritional components that help you use and utilise the omega-3. See, the trouble with the allopaths, they think, oh, this is how much goes in, but there's stages of food. You ingest it, but then you have to digest it and assimilate it, right? In the case of omega-3, it's even more complicated than that, because you have to ingest, digest and assimilate and then elongate. You have to convert it to different forms to make the right building blocks for your brain. And for that you need cofactors, and the critical cofactors are B group vitamins and minerals, which are present in the seed. But if you're taking the oil only, you've distanced yourself from those things, right? And also the oil in the seed is much more likely to be absolutely fresh than the oil in a bottle. Even if that bottle's kept in a freezer, you know, there's production losses on the way. So I really think it's a waste of hemp seed to press them into oil. Yeah, but it's not a good way to spend your money. You do a lot better to buy a kilo of hemp seed and use it in a blender. I usually recommend smoothies and things because we're all too lazy to chew food like Buddhist monks. You're meant to chew it 33 times or something and make it into a milk in your mouth. Everyone just shovels it in like little paupers, right? But if you put it in a blender, and it's very true what you say about flaxseed, you don't digest them unless you blend them, right? But I've sort of moved more and more to chia seed for a number of reasons. They're more acceptable to kids, they taste better, and they don't have any of the goitrogens that sort of marred sort of hemp, flaxseed for a while. And the chia's here, it's Australian grown. Yeah, but the combination of hemp seed and chia, it's a marriage made in heaven. Yeah, it really is. Okay. And then if you combine hemp seed, chia and berries with the antioxidant, mixed berries at different times, you've got something that's really worthwhile, right? And at the risk of sounding like my grandmother, don't forget to eat your greens, right? Critically important, better if you grow your own, right? I mean, everyone says, oh, broccoli's good for you. We grow broccoli out in the garden. My idea of eating broccoli, you go out there with a saucepan with a 1/4 inch of water in, and you cut the flowers into the saucepan, won't put it on the steamer for 10 minutes and then eat it. It's a different experience than a supermarket food, right? Yeah. Health's all around us. I mean, nature is beautiful, right? And once you really tune in to how good nature is and how fantastic your body is, most of people don't experience how fantastic their body is because it's not running very well. It's like a car out of tune. Huh? Yeah. But once that car's tuned up, life becomes not only a pleasure, but an exciting adventure. Right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, yeah. I mean, vary it. And also, I mean, with kids, give them an option, make them involved, right? I mean, feeding kids, it's easy to be theoretical about it. I know just what they should eat, but getting the little buggers to eat it is another matter, right? And the only way I found successful, you have to involve them in it. That's become fun. We're going to have the pink one, we're going to have the cherries, we're going to have this. You know, you've got to play the game. But yeah, different fruits are good. Well, people buy almond milk, and you go look at the packet of almond milk, right? What's it got on it? It's got 2% almonds, and you're paying sort of, once you work it out for how many dollars a kilo of the almonds you're paying, it's astronomical. Probably the most useful is coconut milk or coconut water, right? They'll provide plenty of potassium and medium chain triglycerides, so coconut's probably the best. You can do it just with water, it's not a problem, but coconut milk or coconut water, it becomes a personal taste after that too. Yeah. Usually don't mix it with dairy milk because the saturated fats compete with the omega-3 and reduce the absorption. There's a competitive inhibition. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, good luck, everyone. But yeah, talk it up. There's hemp may not be the solution to everything. It's not the solution to stupidity, but it's a solution to most other things. All right. So we've got the tool in our hands, and we really should use it. All right. Good luck.